Imagine the scenarios. In 1381, in England countryside, tens of thousands of peasants rose up, farming tools in hand, marching straight toward London. They wasn't hungry from like a food, they were furious about new tax, levy equally per head, regardless of the wealth. They wanted fairness. They wanted those who had more to pay more. That uprising were crushed in blood and tears, but the idea behind it, the idea that the rich must shoulder a larger share for society, never died. It kept living, surfacing in every generation, in every crisis, every time a government ran out of money and didn't know what to do. And today, in 2026, that story repeating itself. But this time it's not peasants holding farming tools. This time it's legislators holding pens and writing bills to take the wealthy with the numbers that make many people enthusiastically applaud. Doran Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, wants to impose an additional 2% income tax on everyone earning over $1 million a year. The states of Virginia, Rhode Island, and Washington are considering similar measures. And in California, the play that if it were an independent country, it would be the world fifth largest economy. People are preparing to vote on a 5% wealth tax aimed directly at billionaires, with the promise that it will only be collected once. Across the Atlantic, France is also steering with a campaign to impose a wealth tax. Britain, with a wobbling Labour government, is facing pressure from the left to do the same. Across the Western world, a wave is rising, and the banner they are raising bears the name Robin Hood, he who takes from the rich to give to the poor. It sounds wonderful. It really does. But there is a question that few people bother to stop and ask. Will it actually work? Will this Robin Hood strategy truly patch the enormous budget holes that governments are facing, or is it simply a beautiful political illusion that's hollow on the inside? To understand why that question matters so much, we need to look at the full picture of today's budget crisis. Western governments are genuinely deeply struggling financially, not because they're lazy or incompetent managers, but because they're facing a perfect storm of multiple factors all at once. First is a mountain of debt accumulated over decades of spending more than they collect. Second is a rapidly aging population. As more and more people retire and fewer people work, the social safety net faces enormous pressure. Imagine a seesaw where one side gets heavier every day while the other side gets lighter. That is precisely what's happening to pension funds and public health care in Europe and North America. Third, the post pandemic, post Ukraine invasion world is forcing democratic nations to increase defense spending to levels that decades of peace had caused them to forget were necessary. And while budgets are stretched taut as a bowstring, politicians face a dilemma with no easy solution. Voters are extremely sensitive about money after years of soaring inflation. In the early 2020s, prices surged, purchasing power eroded. People are genuinely worried about making ends meet. So, how do you stand in front of a microphone and say, ladies and gentlemen, we need to raise taxes on everyone? That's political suicide. But if you say we are only raising taxes on the rich, that's an entirely different story. That's a story the vast majority of voters are eager to hear. Because who wouldn't want someone else to foot the bill? And meanwhile, soaring stock markets have swelled the wealth of billionaires to astronomical figures, making the feeling of inequality more acute than ever. That is the fertile ground on which the Robin Hood strategy flourishes. But that strategy has three major problems that people rarely talk about. It doesn't raise enough money, it harms the economy, And even its fairness argument isn't as solid as many people believe. Let's start with the money problem, because this is the most fundamental thing everyone needs to understand clearly. In America, the wealthiest 1% capture about one-fifth of the entire economy's income. That already sounds staggering, but they also pay nearly one-third of all federal taxes. If you use taxes as a measuring stick, the rich in America are already contributing more proportionally than their share of income. America actually has one of the most progressive tax system in the world, meaning the wealthy pay a higher percentage rate than lower earners. But let the actual numbers speak. California's proposed wealth tax, a one-time 5% levy on billionaire assets in a state with one of the world's greatest concentration of billionaires, is expected to raise how much? About 2% of the state's annual economic output. 2%, for a measure described as historic and unprecedented, and Mayor Mamdani's proposal in New York, around zero, 25% of annual economic output, one quarter of 1%. Do you see the problem? It's not that the rich are hiding that much in tax dodges. The problem is far more fundamental. There simply aren't enough wealthy people to fund the entire modern welfare state on their own. Let me use a simple metaphor. Imagine all of society as one big dinner party, and the bill is a cost of government. You can ask the few wealthy people at the VIP table to pay a bit more, but if the bill is large enough, even if you empty every pocket at the VIP table, you still can't cover it. That's mathematics, not ideology. That is precisely why European countries, which have very generous social welfare systems, must rely on broad-based consumption taxes, meaning VAT, levied on almost everything people buy, affecting everyone, and not just the wealthy. In Denmark, Sweden, Norway, those welfare paradises that many people cite as role models, VAT reaches 25%. They don't fund universal health care and education by only taxing the rich. They do it by collecting taxes from everyone. Of course, this doesn't mean the wealthy shouldn't contribute more. There are genuine loopholes in the tax system that the ultra wealthy are exploiting, and those loopholes should be closed. The most glaring is the so-called stepped-up basis in American tax law, a rule that allows an inherited asset's tax basis to be reset to its market value at the time of inheritance, rather than the original purchase price. That sounds technical, so let me explain with a concrete example. Suppose Mr. A buys stock in 1990 for $1 million. By 2026, that stock is worth $1 billion. Mr. A's capital gain is $999 million, but Mr. A doesn't sell. Instead, he uses the stock as collateral to borrow money from a bank, spending comfortably without selling and without triggering any tax liability. When he dies, his children inherit the stock. Under current American law, the tax basis is reset to $1 billion, meaning that $1 billion in gains simply evaporates from the tax ledger, never taxed at all. This is a genuinely absurd loophole, and closing it is legitimate, correct in principle. But even if you close that loophole, how much would you collect? Perhaps less than zero, 1% of GDP annually. Vanishingly small compared to the scale of the budget problems governments are facing. The second problem, and this is something many people don't want to hear, is that taxing the wealthy too heavily can genuinely damage the economy. Let's look at this fairly. Obviously, no one is going to refuse to go to work just because taxes go up a few percentage points. A lawyer or financial professional in New York isn't suddenly going to decide to stay home because the tax rate ticked up. That's obvious. But the problem isn't there. The problem lies with people standing before the decision of whether to accept risk to invest in a new idea, whether to leave a stable job to start a business, whether to pour money into a risky startup. These are marginal decisions, decisions where tax rates can genuinely change the outcome. And this is perhaps one of the least discussed blind spots in the entire debate about taxing the wealthy. The relationship between high taxes and innovation. Recent economic research produces some very thought provoking numbers. For every 1 percentage point increase in income tax, the probability of someone filing a patent application in the following 3 years falls by 6 percentage points. That sounds small, but multiply it across millions of people and decades, and that's an enormous quantity of innovations and inventions that never come into being. And here's what's even more striking: who suffers the most when those innovations never materialize? Not the creators themselves. According to economists' estimates, the person who invents a new product or service only captures about 2% of the total value that invention creates for society. The remaining 98% ripples outward to consumers, to other industries, to society as a whole. So when you reduce the incentives of wealthy people to innovate, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting everyone. Take the internet as an example. This technology was developed in part by engineers and venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, people who fall within the wealthiest 1% of society. They accepted enormous risks. Many failed, but those who succeeded created something the entire human race uses today. The value they captured, though it sounds enormous, was actually only a tiny sliver of what that technology contributes to the global economy. And here's something to keep in mind when looking at the New York example. The highest earners in that city are already facing a combined tax rate federal, state, and local added together of 52%. More than half their income goes to government. At that point, the question is no longer whether they'll quit working, but whether the best talents will choose to come to New York to work and build their careers, or whether they'll seek out places with more favorable tax environments. And here we touch on a very real problem in the age of globalization. Capital and talent are both mobile. When taxes in California rise too high, companies and wealthy individuals move to Texas or Florida, two states with no income tax. When taxes in France increase, thousands of French entrepreneurs and professionals move to London, Brussels, or Dubai. This isn't theory, it's documented, measured reality. Former French President Francois Hollande once imposed a 75% tax on incomes above 1 million euros. What was the result? Tax revenue from that group didn't increase, it fell. Many of them simply left France. Economist Thomas Piketty, famous for his book on inequality and a vocal advocate for heavy taxation of the wealthy, later acknowledged that the measure had failed. It was repealed after 2 years. But let's come to the strongest argument that supporters of taxing the wealthy usually make: the question of fairness. Inequality is rising, the rich keep getting richer, and perhaps this is simply a moral issue. Those who have more must share more, regardless of economic consequences. This is a powerful emotional argument, and it has some factual basis. Soaring stock markets in recent years have generally increased the wealth of those who already had wealth, while many ordinary workers continue to struggle with rising living costs. That sense of injustice is real and legitimate. But reality is far more complicated than that feeling suggests. It turns out that in many Western countries, inequality after accounting for taxes and government spending isn't as bad as many people think and has actually improved over time. In Britain, France, and Japan, income inequality has fallen after accounting for the tax and welfare system. Even in America, often held up as the symbol of inequality since 1990, much of the rise in pre-tax inequality has been offset by increasing redistribution. Taxes on the top 1% are higher, and spending on the poor, especially healthcare, has grown significantly. The Western world is actually doing more redistribution than at any point in history. That doesn't mean the system is perfect or doesn't need reform, but it does mean the argument that the tax system is failing to ensure the rich pay their fair share is not factually accurate in the way many people present it. And there's another dimension of fairness that usually gets overlooked in these debates. Fairness doesn't only mean equalizing incomes. A fair system must also respect legitimate property rights. It must be reasonably predictable so that people can plan their lives and investments. It must allow people to reap rewards proportionate to their risks and efforts. When viewed from this angle, California's proposed one-time 5% levy looks far more troubling. The idea of a one-time tax on existing wealth, not newly generated income, but assets built under a different tax regime, comes very close to the concept of arbitrary seizure of property and the promise that this will only happen once. The history of special one-time levies in politics suggests that's not the kind of promise worth trusting. But perhaps the deepest problem with the Robin Hood strategy isn't economic at all, it's political, or more precisely, it's about political philosophy. There's something that few people say out loud, but that matters enormously. In a healthy democracy, every citizen should have a personal stake in ensuring public spending is managed wisely and efficiently. When you pay taxes, you care about how that money is used. You ask questions. You vote based on budget management performance. But when most of the cost of government is borne by a small group of people, the rest of the public tends to care less about what that money is spent on. They don't personally feel the cost of bad decisions. And that creates a political environment where wasteful or ineffective programs pass more easily. Polls and behavioral economics experiments show this clearly. When people don't personally contribute money to a system, they perceive the cost and benefits of that system far less accurately. They lean toward supporting more spending without fully weighing the price. A stronger society is one where the many contribute together and benefit together. When you pay taxes and your healthcare system depends on that funding, you want hospitals to be well managed. When you pay taxes and your children attend public school, you want that school to have quality. That is the healthy democratic connection between taxpayer and government. Of course, this doesn't mean everyone must pay the same taxes, regardless of income. A progressive tax system where the wealthy pay a higher rate remains the foundation of a fair society. But there is an important line between reasonable progressivity and only hitting a small group while exempting everyone else. Now, let's look toward the future, because here is something genuinely fascinating and simultaneously worrying. Artificial intelligence is transforming the structure of the economy at breathtaking speed. And almost everyone in the technology sector agrees that if AI develops along its current trajectory, it could concentrate income in the hands of the few who own and control this technology in ways we have never seen in history. When an AI program can replace tens of thousands of knowledge workers, where does the economic value created accumulate? Not with the workers being replaced, but with those who own AI companies, investors who got in early, and the rare engineers with the skills to build and operate these systems. Inequality in that scenario could dwarf anything we're discussing today. If that world arrives, then questions about how to tax fairly and effectively will need to be rethought from scratch. Tax policy designed for an ordinary industrial or service economy may be completely unsuitable for an economy where a large portion of GDP is generated by machines owned by a handful of people. But here's the important point. That world hasn't arrived yet. We're debating tax policy for the world of today, not for a hypothetical future. And in today's world, the arguments supporting the Robin Hood strategy are stronger politically than they are economically. In the end, what I want you to leave this with is this. The appeal of the Robin Hood strategy is not accidental. It taps into very real emotions: outrage at inequality, the desire for fairness, and the wish that someone else will foot the bill. Those emotions are not wrong. Inequality is a genuinely worrying problem. The tax loopholes that the ultra wealthy exploit are genuinely unfair and need to be fixed. But powerful emotions and good policy don't always travel together. Good policy must be grounded in real evidence, must account for all consequences, including the ones not immediately visible, must not unfairly burden anyone, and must actually achieve its stated goals. And here is the core paradox of the whole issue. Governments that chase the Robin Hood strategy to win over voters in the short term may be actively sabotaging their ability to solve the real problems they claim to want to fix. Because when revenues come in lower than expected, when economic growth slows, when the best talent and capital migrate elsewhere, the final bill, as history has shown time and again, will be paid by the very people the policy was designed to protect. Robin Hood is a romantic figure. He rides through enchanted forest, shoots arrows with perfect precision at his enemies, and hands gold pouches to the suffering poor. But economic governance is not a romantic novel. It is the art of uncomfortable trade-offs, imperfect decisions in a complex world, and the responsibility to look further than the appealing headline on the front page. The real question is not, should the rich pay taxes? The answer is obviously yes. The question is, which tax system will be simultaneously fair, financially powerful enough, and unlikely to slow down the wealth creating engine from which all of us ultimately benefit? That is a harder, duller, far less exciting question than let's tax the billionaires. But it is the right question. And in politics, as in life, asking the right question is usually far more important than having a simple answer to the wrong one.